Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's September 2024, and we're just almost 3 months into a new Labour government in England, in Britain. And I want today to discuss an aspect of monetary policy, or rather of the difficulty of making monetary policy work in a modern liberal democracy like Britain. I'm going to focus on Britain, which is my own country, but in fact it's relevant all over the world to nations that have got a mix of the public sector and the private sector in their economies. It means practically all economies. Now, the issue I want to focus on is the differential effect of monetary policy in the private and public sectors. I've just written a short book on the quantitative theory of money, a new restatement, and in that I showed how changes in the quantity of money affect economic activity and then affect inflation through working via the private sector. For example, companies can obviously go bust, so they must have some money around in the bank account or perhaps on a borrowing facility, but they must have some money around to be able to pay their bills. So for the whole economy, meaning the private part of the whole economy, the use of money is fundamental. People can go bust, they have limited creditworthiness. They can make payments only if they can use money balances, and so on. So monetary policy really works in the private sector. I pointed out the impact of changes in the quantity of money on the value of the stock market, on the value of houses. Obviously, the stock market's owned mostly by a private investor. Houses are owned by private households. Monetary policy works through the private sector. It doesn't work through the public sector. The government is a very different kind of agent from any private sector agent. Within its own borders, it can tax, and it can also borrow principal without limit from the central bank. It therefore doesn't need to hold a large money balance at the central bank. The government usually doesn't have any accounts in commercial banks. It does have an account at the central bank. There is a money balance there for the Treasury. Here in Britain, we've got the pictures of the Treasury and the Bank of England, sometimes regarded as husband and wife, by the way. But the way that the government's finances work is that the balance for the exchequer, as it's called, at the Bank of England is less than one day's tax revenue, typically, whereas public spending in total is in 2024-25 expected to be 44% of GDP. Now, essentially, the government spending is not related to its money balance. It's not constrained by the quantity of money it keeps in a bank account. Utterly different from the private sector. Now, you might say, when you look at this, that this is a huge problem. After all, the public sector, looked at this way, total public spending is 44% of GDP. Well, it's not quite like that. And what I want to do now is to explain the right concept of the public sector when we're thinking about this problem. It's not a new issue in Britain's way of governing, and Britain's political economy goes back indeed right to the early 20th century, when we had beginnings of a large public sector. And in the 1970s, this was a huge problem. I, among a number of other people, particularly myself actually, emphasized that monetarism by itself was not enough to defeat inflation. There also needed to be control of wage growth and prices in the public sector. Of course, much of the public sector, there's no charging. Children go to school, they're not charged for going to school. They go to the National Health Service, they aren't charged for medical attention. And so what you have here is a kind of bargaining situation. It's not a situation where people, and the bargaining is between one buyer, the government, and through the public sector unions, one seller. You get this collective bargaining. It's a sort of a kind of game theoretical problem. And in the 1970s, it was very important for Britain to face these problems. In the late 70s, the problem was particularly serious, and this is a big part of the agenda for the first Thatcher government was to bring this problem under control. Now, I've just said that in Britain, public expenditure as a whole is to be 44% of GDP in 24-25. But let's be clear that a large part of that figure of 44% isn't really staying inside the government, inside the public sector. What the government does is to tax people and companies, and then makes payments to people and companies, and often, in fact, the same people and companies, so there's a kind of merry-go-round going around. These are called transfer payments. Now, in this chart, I've got the, probably can't read the detail, but the different components of public spending in 2024-25. There's debt interest. Obviously, the government has to tax to pay the interest on its debt, but the interest on the debt goes back to the bondholders inside the private sector. There's payments of welfare, tax to collect, to pay the welfare, but then the welfare is received by people, households in the private sector. There are pensions. And the items that I've actually put together there, they themselves are about 40% of total public spending. On top of that, there's subsidies to companies, there's payments to universities, strictly not part of the public sector. And so, roughly speaking, about half of that 44% figure is transfer payments. So the concept of the public sector that's outside the effects of monetary policy is kind of like reduced to a bit of a 20%. Then on top of that, we need to remember that the state buys many goods and some services from the private sector too. Most capital spending is to build schools, hospitals, goes in the construction sector, supplied by private companies. State buys weapons from privately owned defence contractors. And so the true public sector, where the state is employing people and also producing value-added part of national output, is much, much smaller than that 44% figure. As a rough rule of thumb, a reasonable point of view is that it's around, in most countries, about 15 to 20% of GDP and of employment. So monetary policy is working in over 80% of the economy. Monetary policy can bring inflation down, can affect macroeconomic outcomes, and so on. The central bank is indeed very powerful. Now, it's important, I said at the start, we're just in 3 months into a Labour government. On the whole, Labour is much closer to the public sector unions and the public sector than the Conservatives are. Very important part about how Britain works. And I'm going to argue in the next few minutes that this Labour government is not like the last one. The last one tried to keep its distance from the public sector unions. This one, it appears, isn't. It's trying to quite close to them. Here we have a chart of the ratio of public sector employment to total employment. In 1979, public sector employment was about 30% of the total. This was when Margaret Thatcher came to power. As I said, part of the agenda was to keep inflation down, to get, and a crucial aspect of it was indeed this public sector problem. Between 1984 and 1997, there was a large continuing program of privatization, and this caused a big fall in the ratio of public sector employment to the total. There's also exposure of formerly kind of protected industries to market forces. In the early 1970s, the only supplier of telephones in Britain was the post office. Nowadays, of course, there are several competing phone companies, and there are many ways of communication over and above phones through online and so on. The broadcasting used to be just ITV and BBC. There are now dozens of. So that the growth of, there's more competition. There's been extensive privatization, and that has reduced the share of public sector employment to the total. I'd like also to notice in this chart that there are these couple of blips upwards in the ratio of public sector workers, the total in 1990 and 2009-10. That reflected this point that the public sector is not exposed to market forces, not exposed to the effects of monetary policy in the same way as the private sector. So public sector employment rose relative to private sector employment. One final thing to say about this chart is that, this is something that hasn't received much attention, is that in the growth of nursery education and care for the elderly mostly, in the 2010s, much of that was done in the private sector, not by the state. That was one of the things that the last Conservative government did. Although, you can see just towards the end, that line is starting to blip up again. There was loss of control of public spending under, for example, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Okay, so whereas 1979, public sector employment was 30% of the total, so this problem about the public sector being immune to monetary policy views was a huge problem. It's less of a problem at the moment, and actually it became least important at around about 2016, 2017. The public sector is much more unionized than the private sector, and what this chart shows is the importance of trade union membership relative to the total. So in 1979, you had very high public sector employment relative to total, and also a peak of trade union membership relative to total employment. You see it starting to come down there. This was reflected partly the Conservative government trying to, of 79 to 97, trying to bring trade unions under control. And that decline in the share of trade union membership, the total, carried on through the new Labour government of 1997 to 2010. Continued a little bit, again also under the last Conservative government. The Blair government did not want the public sector unions to interfere with their approach to governing. You can see here, this is something from the Morning Star about how Blair misled the trade unions. He said, give them some more legislative power. He didn't. And here finally is a chart on the relative importance of trade union membership in the public and private sectors. Public sector unions account for about half of employment in the public sector. In the private sector, only about an eighth of people are in a union. So you can see the private sector, there are some unions, but they're not very important. And the setting of prices and wages is mostly in market contexts where competition matters, where everybody's checking what they have in the bank, where monetary policy works. Public sector is very different. This problem of a large public sector making it more difficult for monetary policy to work is less important in Britain than it used to be. And over the last, well, it's now going to be, what is it, almost 45 years, from 1979, there's been a dramatic change in the way that, in the relative importance of both public sector employment and of the trade unions. But we're now 3 months into a Labour government. I said at the start it was a new Labour government, new with a small letter, not a capital letter. This Labour government does not look like the Blair Labour government. In the first few weeks, there have been announcements of big pay awards for public sector workers. No strings attached, no requirements to improve productivity. That will impact on total public spending, that will affect the budget deficit. Okay, that's gone through. The government doesn't want to fight these unions. And then we've also got signs that something like half of the Labour MPs that have now been elected, they have a very large majority in the House of Commons, about half of them receive money from trade unions. This is not a new feature of British politics. It started in the early 20th century. It was something that the Blair government tried to limit. They didn't want Labour too much associated with the trade unions. The present Labour government appears to be, again, it uses this expression, hand in glove with the trade unions. How important will this problem become? I don't know. But it is going to make it more difficult to keep inflation under control, just as it did in the 1970s. I can't tell you exactly how bad this problem is going to become. It was a big problem in the 1970s, and one has to hope that it isn't a problem again in the years to come. Thank you.